I've seen just like what we are experiencing.
Summary of the, I don't know if you know what did it, the note well of the dispatch. You have the right to remain silent.
That's Murray.
Yeah, that was good.
For those of you here for Acme, we are now actively soliciting a Japper relay. Oh, Joe. Well, we will also now be actively soliciting note takers. Joe, having leapt on Jabber Relay, is now out of the note taker thing. Now I'm looking at Robin, who is seriously silly, but no. Etherpad is fine, but we really don't need he said, she said. We're looking for results. So it was decided that actions is all we're looking for. We have one. Thank you. All right. So thanks to Robin and Joe, we are already ahead of the game because we have identified.
So let's here, to make this easier for you. We had stickers to give away. Yeah, I'm so used to giving away stickers. They didn't put them in this time, huh?
The virtual stickers go to.
Yeah. So the question is, we'll limit it to 2 lines. 1, approved draft. 2, not meeting.
This would be a fine set of minutes to turn in.
Yeah.
I do not believe our area directors would be upset with those minutes at all.
Final draft approved, working group closing.
This is a great set of minutes.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, we should change the,
I'm trying so hard.
Honestly, I would hope that people would try to be this video not that we're at IETF.
For those of you who are remote, welcome Eric, Sean, Thomas, and Carl. Can you wave in the Jabber room that you can hear us?
Jabber relay, are they waiting? I'll tell you when I'm in.
Is anybody in Jabber to see them waiting? They are waiting?
Eric, Carl.
Okay, so any of them will reply, they heard, and therefore.
Yeah.
All right. So the blue seats are circulated. We have a Jabber scribe and we have a note taker. Thank you to Robin and Joe. You are in Berlin. If you did not seek to be in Berlin, welcome anyway, but willkommen til. This is the note well. If you haven't been in an IETF before, you have not seen this. If you have been in an IETF before, you've seen it many, many times. The note well is a brief pointer for certain values of brief to our IPR-related RFCs. Please review the RFCs. If you have not done so, they describe the duties you have taken on should you make a contribution. That includes either messages to the mailing list, discussion at the mic, interpretive dance, smoke signals, really quite a broad thing. Please be aware of what duties you are taking on should you endeavor to communicate to the working group. And now, the agenda. This is the point of the agenda where you are allowed to agenda bash. It's one of the administrivia pieces. We plan to discuss the Acme issue list, go through the review of changes to the document and upcoming changes, what preparations we need to take on for working group last call. We've allocated some time for that, and then 40 minutes for what's next. Should we quietly close down or soldier on into new and uncharted territories which would need to be chartered? Is there any bashing of the agenda as presented? Seeing none, I invite our esteemed document author, who is wearing an appropriately pink shirt, to stand in the pink box. The pink box, oh, interpretive dance.
Very interpretive.
Is that that's covered by note well? Yeah.
Yeah.
Good. So I have no IPR that I know of in that interpretive dance. Yeah, I'm not aware of any IPR on that.
He has to
interpretive dance.
reasonably and personally know if there is IPR covering the interpretive dance, and he has said he does not.
All right. Next slide. I think Ted already said all these. We had a rather rushed set of changes going up to the internet draft deadline, so I figured we'd spend some time going through what the changes were that went into the document in case we want to back some of them out, just to make sure that everyone's okay with the things that went in. Then I've got a list of open questions, mix of things that are in the issue tracker on GitHub, and a couple things that are noted in the document that kind of came to mind as we were making some of the changes in this draft. And then I think the goal here is to get to a list of kind of a punch list for the last few things we have to do to get to last call, because the chairs keep reminding me that they were hoping to get a last call at this IETF, and maybe it's going to slip a couple months, but I think it's still, the end is in sight. So let's the goal of this session, I think, is to get to what else we need to do to start considering this done. Next slide, please, and keep going. So this is the usual metrics slide, copied and pasted from GitHub. 27 pull requests from last time. Yeah, there was some complaining on the mailing list about the spike of activity around the draft deadline, and that is completely legitimate. As I'll discuss later, the other authors and I have had some conversations about having a more rhythmic pace after this IETF and getting things done a little more smoothly. So that's an acknowledged problem. We'll try and do better next time. Next slide, please. So I want to call out a few highlights from the changes that were made in this last rev. There were a couple of security changes we made. The one I hadn't thought about at all was someone came along and pointed out the risk of server-side request forgery. Who has heard of server-side request forgery in this room? This was new to me when this issue was posted. I think I'd seen these attacks before, but hadn't heard that phrase for them. What this guy pointed out was that the HTTP challenge type causes the CA, the server, to go make an HTTP request out to the validation server to verify the client's control of that domain name. And it's a very structured request to try and minimize the surface, minimize the control the client can do. But the guy who filed the issue pointed out that if that server is malicious, then he can send a redirect response, and if the CA follows redirects, then he'll go send an HTTP GET query to that server. And so if you have a server that's going to pass back some information that he got from that GET request, then it's possible for an attacker to get some information from an arbitrary server on the internet from the vantage point of the CA. And this can be a risk if there's, say, internal web services inside the CA infrastructure that you might be able to get out and get information this way. So this came to mind. The reporter noticed that the implementation of Acme that's being used by Let's Encrypt actually has some of this risk in that the error reporting that the server provides has of the first few bytes of the response from the validation server to facilitate debugging. So if there were some vulnerable web services inside of Let's Encrypt's infrastructure, it was possible that an attacker could have extracted those first few bytes of the response. So this is just a clarification to say you really should make sure that your infrastructure doesn't have any web services that are going to do anything, and that you wouldn't want people to be accessing. Really make sure that the things doing your HTTP validations can only talk to the internet, can only talk to things that are publicly accessible, because that's what it's there for. So that's mainly a clarification, some operational considerations. Pull request number 150, we made, in response to Karthik's analysis and some operational learnings from Let's Encrypt, we made some changes to the key rollover transaction on how the signatures were arranged, and in the process of that, omitted one of the things that we needed to sign over. I think the signature was, had signatures by the new key and the old key covering the new key. When in reality, you need to cover both the old key and the new key to signify that both the old key and the new key consented to the transition, not just the new key. So there's some replay risk in the old structure. Change the signature format to cover it, cover both keys now, so that's fixed. There's a little bit more fiddling to do with that a little bit later in slides. It's an open issue. Also following on from Karthik's analysis, Karthik noted that with the limited replay, or not replay protection, we had this resource field in the JWS signing that said the type of Acme resource you were sending something to. So I'm sending this to the new authorization resource, or to a challenge resource, or to a registration resource. Karthik's analysis pointed out what we sort of already knew, which is that if you have an intermediary that can shuffle these responses, then they can shuffle responses around within those resource classes, and there's some risks that arise due to that shuffling. So as we discussed at the last IETF meeting, we changed from using this resource field to using the full URL to which the thing is sent. And I want to dive into that a little bit, so on the next slide. So yeah, we took this resource field and changed it into URL. So now when the server gets a signed object from the client, it's supposed to take that URL field and compare it to the request URI of the request, and make sure that they're semantically the same thing. Now we had this big discussion, I think we spent 20 or 30 minutes on it at the last IETF meeting, about how comparing URIs is non-trivial, especially when you're deriving one of them from the parameters you get in an HTTP request. So there's kind of some weasel words in the current spec saying that you have to compare the URL parameter to the request URI. And if they do not match, then you consider the request unauthorized. This, like I said, feels kind of weaselly, and I would love suggestions for how to improve this. Ted, you're looking pensive.
Ted Hardy from the floor microphone. So I believe that when we discuss this, and I think my advice as an individual is that we treat the fact that this says URL as if it said fleeing, right? The fact that it is something you could pass to a URL parser and dereference is unrelated to its role here as a string exact match result, right? And so I think that what we want to say here is basically that this is string exact match, and the fact that it happens to be a URL is unrelated to the processing you do on it to do that matching. So do not do any of the more complex URL matching that you might do to say that these are semantically equivalent, like percent encoding checks or any of that. If it is not string exact match, you failed. Mm-hmm. And I think to some extent, the fact that we call it a URL parameter is a necessary evil, but I think that for this purpose, we should just pretend in our heads we called it fleeing.
Yeah. And I tried to get at that in the second paragraph I've quoted here, which says, if you got this in an Acme message, if you got this out of the directory or out of a location header, you must use that string to facilitate the string matching. Although it sounds, can I try and paraphrase what you said? Sounds like what you're saying is that whatever chunk of code on the server this request lands at should consider itself to have a label, that is labels this chunk of code, and it's going to look like a URL because that's how HTTP request routing works, but it's basically just a label that the thing knows and is going to compare to this URL parameter.
Right, but if you look at the URI matching algorithms that are listed in 3986, it basically says there's a hierarchy. Mm-hmm. And one part of the hierarchy is to say whether or not it's an exact match that's doing here. Don't look at any of that for this purpose, right? What you really want to say is that for the purposes of gauging whether or not they match, we're going to say it's string exact match. Otherwise, we're going to fail. And there might be cases. Can you go back to slide? So there might be cases where if the server compares it and they don't match, they would have been semantically equivalent, mm-hmm. but that's okay. It's better, much better in this case, to have a false negative of things that would have been semantically equal than to permit cases where a false positive could creep in. So I really think just treat it as if it was an opaque label for the matching purpose is the right way to go.
So let me throw one more nuance in here. So to do a string compare, you need two strings. One string is the thing that's in the URL header of the JWS. What would you specify to be the other one?
Isn't it the URL parameter, right?
Well, that's one of them. But as you know, an HTTP request doesn't come with a full URL typically. It comes with a host header, which may have a port attached, and a path that's up in the request URI, and a scheme that may or may not be derived from the transport.
So you're suggesting that if it's canonicalized in one particular server in a way that's different from the way the parameter is written, that the canonicalization might be generating something that causes the string exact match to fail because, let's say, the host header emitted by one particular user agent, it's always uppercase because they like that.
Or, the client and the server disagree on whether or not port 80 or port 443 is included in the URL to be matched. Jeff, you had a comment?
So where you say request URI hi, Jeff Hodges, where you say request URI in the first paragraph, do you not mean effective request URI from the RFC 723X series?
Yes.
Okay, that was not a phrase I was familiar with, so.
Right, it got introduced in that series of specs.
Okay, great.
But your question about G, can you just offhand do an exact match between those two things because there might be case differences and such? I think that's still relevant.
Yeah.
So no.
Yeah, so Martin Thompson, I've looked at this particular problem very, very recently, and it's nasty. So RFC 7230 has a section on URI normalization, and that talks about, it makes some recommendations about what you can do regarding percent encoding, case, did you realize that you can put a host name, then a colon, and then a slash, and leave nothing there? The colon can be stupid, but that's how they work. And so it makes a number of recommendations, but it doesn't go all the way to recommending anything that's even close to interoperable in this context. However, you will find that in most cases here, you won't have a problem because the URLs are generated by the servers. Is that right? And I think what you probably want to say is perform some simple transformations and as much as possible, keep the octets that the server sent you, and then it'll probably work. And in situations where it doesn't, well, back to debugging, I guess. And there'll be a lot of, well, don't do that then, involved in this, which is, I know that sounds terrible, but I don't know that there's any better advice that I can give at this point.
So let me see if I can translate that and make sure that what I heard and what you said agree.
Yeah.
Because the server generates the URL that's going to be used by the client to generate the request.
Yes.
The client should use the generated URL in as an exact form as it is possible for the client to do in emitting the request back to the server. If there is composition required because of the host header to do that, it may chunk it, but it should make no other change so that when the server gets it, reassembles it, the string exact match works.
Yeah, and maybe the server can recover its process for generating the URL in the first place in order to make that process. Because what's going to be happening here is that these URLs, I believe, appear in JSON that the server generates and sends down. So that there will be a UTF-8 encoding of these things that are present on the wire as the server will have originally conceived of them. So there are a few techniques that we can use to sort of minimize the chance that this is going to get screwed up. I would recommend that that clients use the absolute form, but I know that we can't guarantee that because of the way that people use HTTP clients. Stuff gets lost in translation. But
well, remember the handling of this URL in the sense that matters here is at the JWS layer before it gets anywhere close to the HTTP layer.
Right. So if you recommend that the client uses the URL that it got from the server in JSON as it appeared in the JSON that it was provided, and that you don't use the effective request URL in any of the JWS processing, I think you would sort of sidestep the splitting up into the host header and the path component and all those sorts of other things.
So essentially we're saying this is supposed to be a round trip the bytes you got from the server into this, and this will work. If you do anything else, Lord help you.
Yeah, I think that's the point. I think, okay, so I think what we can say here is every resource you might possibly send a post to is addressed with a URL that you got from the server.
Right.
And you have to use that exact string, or all bets are off.
Yeah.
Or you must use that string. So basically take this latter paragraph, and I think what we should do is elaborate the server side of that and say the server must do the same thing, must do the other side of that, and the server must require that clients do this.
Yeah, I don't know if you wanted belt and braces on this one and go any further about making recommendations about how to construct that string, but I think what you want to do is there's going to be some information embedded in that URL that the server will have to recover, and you could possibly recommend that the server recover that information using whatever method it can, and then reconstruct the string as it would have done when it sent it to the client, and hopefully that would produce the same output.
As an example, yeah.
As an example,
Sure.
yeah.
All right, good. Good job of IETF solving minutia. This is an important one. Okay, so the other major thing that I regret went in at the last minute here and should have gone out for a little more discussion, but I wanted to put it out in a relatively concrete form for folks to look at, is this idea of applications. So this application is the current word. I'm not super satisfied with it. It was also discussed under the name preconditions in, I think, the last IETF and in some of the threads on the list. But the idea here is to make the issuance process we have in Acme a little more flexible. So we wanted to support a little more variety in CA issuance flows. So there's some CA issuance flows right now where the client is only told what it needs to do to get the certificate after it has already sent in its CSR to describe the certificate it wants, which is not true in draft 02 Acme. In draft 02 Acme, there's an assumption that the client, if the client fills out the right authorizations, then he can just issue the certificate without any further question and answer. So this first case wouldn't be supported in the original Acme flow. Some CAs right now also require a reauthorization per issuance. So if you prove that you own example.com when you issue one certificate and you want a second certificate with example.com, they will require you to prove again that you own example.com. And so there is a desire for some scoping to authorizations here. So there was also a desire that we discussed some last time. Phil raised the need for a cash box out of Acme. And so there was a need to have some requirements for issuance other than authorization. Right now in the document, we have a requirements framework, and it has two requirements: authorization and out of band, star, do whatever else here. But the idea is, in the original flavor of Acme, the draft 02 flavor, the only thing that you could do to satisfy the server that it should give you a certificate was prove that you own the relevant domains. There were no other conditions that the server could impose. And so, yeah, like I said, there's a lot of assumptions that draft 02 Acme made that were restricted from addressing these use cases. And I should say that the source for a lot of these use cases is kind of a loose survey I did starting from SSLmate and looking at a couple of other CA issuance APIs. But I think this is a pretty okay survey that covers a broad swath of current practice. So I'd be glad if there's other CAs in the room to tell me that I'm full of it, and these are not actual requirements, and we should just revert everything, make it a lot simpler. But I get the sense that this is, at least the cash box one, is going to be a hard requirement here. So the idea here, let's see, next slide, I think. Yeah, so as we discussed them on the list, the big change here is in draft 02, what the client does is it shows up, it registers, it does a bunch of authorizations, proves it owns a bunch of domains, and then it sends in a CSR and gets a certificate. And what we've done in this is we've just swapped those latter two steps. So first, the client sends in the CSR and says, here's the certificate I would like to get. And then the server responds to that and says, here's what you have to do to get that certificate. And that's, like I said, there's two things it can require in the spec right now. It can say you have to fulfill these authorizations, you have to prove you own these domains, and there's an out-of-band requirement. It can say you have to go to this website and follow whatever the instructions are there. And then once you've done this, once you've satisfied this, the CA goes ahead and issues a certificate. Next slide, I've got some pretty pictures. So yeah, this is the old flow. So client shows up, makes a registration, does another post to create a new authorization for whatever the domain is he wants to. Are you just looking? Okay. These are also on the materials page if you want to have them close up on your laptop. This is just my kind of cartoon of how the process works. So the client says, I would like authorization for example.com. The server creates a challenge to say, here's how you can prove example.com. The client sets everything up and says, okay, I'm ready. Green, I'm representing, gray on the left, I'm representing these pending states. So the server issued it, but it doesn't know if it's valid or not. Once the client responds to the challenge, the server goes off and validates it, which is not shown here. But once it's validated, it turns the challenge green. It says the challenge is good. Notify, at that point, once the challenge has been completed, the authorization is good. The client polls to see when that happens, and then once the authorization is good, the client can send a new certificate request. This should look pretty familiar if you know the old spec. This is just kind of a graph so we can compare with the new stuff. Any questions about this? Clarifications?
Isn't that get backwards?
Well, yeah, it's intended to illustrate information flow as opposed to request response flow. But yeah. Next slide, please. So here is the flow we have in the current draft. So you can see there is another layer compared to the last one. That's just the slide layout. But the idea here is you show up, you register, and then instead of sending a new authorization request, you send in an application for a certificate. That was the word I picked out of the ether. Not totally satisfied. If you have a better word, I'd love to hear it. But what the application says is it's basically the same thing that was in the new certificate message before. It's a CSR and the not before, not after dates I would like. It's an application for a certificate. Go ahead, Ecker.
So say I have a system where I have a separation between the origin servers, which are getting the certificates, and the authorization system, which is approving them. And now, in the current design, as I understand it, that means I need to make a dummy CSR, which I actually wish not to be fulfilled, in order to determine the conditions for, So I can't stand up purely my authorization system without standing up one of the instances of the things which actually will be the certified entities, correct?
That is correct. In this system, you cannot obtain authorization without also obtaining a certificate.
Yeah. Yes,
I mean,
I think it's lame. I think I just said so, which is that it means I cannot build a separated system without having a dummy CSR that I wish not to be authorized. So I know I've got 1,000 domain names. I got 1,000 domain names that I wish to be able to issue certificates for, and then I'm going to spin up a variety of web servers, which will then go request those certificates or not, and I'm going to authorize them. Now those all have to be spun up before I can do anything.
Thompson?
So I'm wondering, is the authorization strictly subject to the application? Is it entirely owned by, or will they exist independent of?
So in the current spec, it's there is an option for the CA to scope the authorization to the
registration.
To scope the authorization to the application.
Right. Because I think Eka's concern might be addressed by using the dummy CSR in that case, and you can throw away the private key.
No, I want it not. That's just stupid. I don't want it to be. I don't want a CSR.
So like you could monkey patch this by just having a flag in the request that says, "I'm just doing this to see the requirements. Don't actually issue the certificate."
No, he wants the authorization to be fulfilled and reusable for the later thing. The question is, can you reuse the authorization for something else?
Yeah, well, and that's ultimately going to be up to the CA's policy.
Of course.
Right?
Again, my question is not.
So the point is like this.
My point is
authorization.
My point is the only
completely
working,
useless in a case where the authorizations are only good for
I understand, but my point is the only actual working Acme CA does not have the policy you're suggesting, and so it is extraordinarily silly to design the system. I understand what you're saying is let's design for the most restricted policy, but that restricted policy imposes annoying conditions on the customer.
So there was a brief exchange on the list about should we keep around new authorization, because you could design a flow where like if you offer a new authorization endpoint in the directory, that's a CA's way of saying I support generic authorizations. You can come here and pre-authorize, and we can do the traditional the Acme dance you know and love, and then you can come along and do this application thing, and all the things will just pop in there, and you'll be good to go. You won't have to do any more authorizations. Feedback on the list at that point was, if we're going to do this, let's go ahead and kill a new authorization. But if you think this is an important use case,
I just think it's unfortunate. And it seems to me that like that the operating conditions that I use for the operating conditions that I use for the keys that I actually do terminate, that actually wish to certify for, may be totally different from the keys that I wish to be authorizing. Let me give you a concrete example. Say that what I wish to do is I wish to issue ED25551 certificates with ED25519 in the terminal identity, or even more aggressively, say I wish to issue a Diffie-Hellman certificate with X25519 in the terminal identity, right? So now what I'm going to do is but on the other hand, that's like in my web server somewhere. And my box that does the registration has never heard of X25519, and it's doing P256. So now what I have to do is I'm going to make a fake certificate which contains some sort of lame key which is of no use to anybody, and which I wish not to be that valid.
So this part I don't think is actually all that meaningful, because either way, like whichever order you wish to send the CSR in, like the cert management box has to get a CSR from the box that has the real key at some point. You're just saying it has to do it up front instead of when you.
Yeah, but I understand. My point is you say, oh, it doesn't matter. Why not just get a dummy certificate and not worry about it? And what I'm saying is that there may be conditions where those certificates have completely different characteristics than what I eventually wish to issue because my systems are not compatible. So yeah, I do think that like that this is like not an opportune time to like take out something which is like a basic use case. For what strikes me as basically an aesthetic argument about keeping everything in one flow.
Is
So
it going to
let-
hurt that much?
Let me ask the question that was asked before, which I didn't hear you answer, which is, if the new applications flow is restored so that both this new flow and the original flow are supported, do you have a problem? And if so, what is that problem?
I think that'd be fine.
Mark?
It wouldn't be the original flow. It would still have an application in order to get it to a certificate. It's
Yes.
just that you could,
So-
all the
so-
authorizations would.
But it would
pre-baked.
restore new applications in order to get the ordering that he.
New
It would restore
authorization.
new authorization.
So in the room, we'll clearly have to take this to the list for confirmation. But in the room, is there anybody who objects to having both flows supported? And if so, could you come to the microphone and tell us why? Okay, so we'll take the question to the list to confirm that restoring the, or having both flows supported isn't an issue for anybody else. But for the moment, let's write that down as the tentative resolution and move on.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And I think I would probably add that since we have this scoping requirement around now, I would probably require that authorizations created through that mechanism be unscoped, because what would you scope them to? But that makes sense. All right, so that's the overview of the applications mechanism. I think next slide just has a couple of little considerations, smaller than one Echo raised. Yeah, this looks mostly the same from the client and server point of view. Server has to do a little bit more state tracking, but it's pretty minor. But like the last bullet says, this is very much a first cut, very open to suggestions, comments. Yeah, and I've highlighted some in the spec, there's some in the next section. All right, so I think that's it for current spec. Any other notes people have, thoughts on what went in 03? Again, apologize for the late rush at the deadline. Hope the 2 weeks between then and now have been useful to folks to catch up on what's in the spec. All right, so we have some issues in the issue tracker and some in the doc. Wanted to call these out and see if folks have any thoughts. So one thing someone had asked for is some explicit indication of the Acme version in the protocol. So right now we don't have that. There's no place in the protocol where the server says, this is the Acme version I support, or the client says, this is the version I support. The issue, the guy who filed the issue said that you can put this in the directory, in the meta container we have, where the server can state metadata about its Acme service. In thinking about this a little bit, though, it occurs to me there might be some subtleties here given the kind of decoupled way this thing is designed. So you might have a registration, an account you created with a V1, with the CA via the V1 protocol. And maybe the server is upgraded to V2 and is willing to persist those registrations. And so there's some V1 stuff that persists into V2. Maybe this isn't an issue. It just sort of seemed like there might be some subtlety here. Anyone have preferences on stating versions? Right now you can state it by using different URLs per version, as is commonly done with web APIs. So maybe there's not a need here at all. Phil?
I totally want the version to be in band, because that's the only way it can be authenticated. Since we're going to be doing this stuff, yes, you're doing it over HTTP today, but we might want to do it over different protocols. HTTP is probably not going to be around forever. I certainly don't want to have the fewer connections that there are to the Acme stuff to what it's riding on, the better. So yes, always put the version number in band. It's just not a close call.
So Phil, do you think that we should then create a version number and put it inside of the authenticated envelope? Interesting proposal.
Yeah, Martin Thompson, the thing that worries me in that regard, and I think Phil's comment sort of highlights that, is if we make changes to the protocol that have subtle implications on the semantics of various fields that are under protection, we have this problem where things that were signed in one context can be used in another context, and we have to think about the way that they interact with each other in nasty ways. And if there's an explicit version, it can just be a string saying, this is Acme, right? Then we're done, right? You just check that it's the same. If it's not the same, buff. Very simple thing. And I think this is a reasonable thing.
And the key here is we have to think about it. I much prefer things that we don't have to think about. And we put this thing in now, we don't end up having a 3-year, how do we move to version next?
So Martin Thompson again, the thing that we're doing in TLS 1.3 is we're prefixing everything that we sign with TLS 1.3 and some other information typically. This basically does the same thing because we're using JWS and you just have to include it somewhere.
So that would address the post bodies sent by the client, but not anything sent by the server. Unless we were to add a field to all of the server responses that says this is the version. And then it would be authenticated by HTTPS.
Yeah, I suspect that this is probably okay because the general model that we're operating on is that the client authenticates its information by using JWS and signing things, and the server authenticates its responses by putting them in HTTPS.
So do you think we should also have a server sent version number?
Why not?
Or is
just go the same? Just make it completely symmetric. Just say every single object that we generate. You used to have a type on everything, right?
I don't think it was on everything, but sure.
Yeah, there was a
challenges all have a type. Requirements all have a type.
Yeah, but then we
was mainly
moved
for
to
stuff.
just including the URI because that was considered more precise. But now there's this idea that, well, it's just a URI. What does it actually mean? It doesn't carry any. I can't check that now. So I think that, yeah, you may as well.
Well,
just make
that's
it
still
completely
focused
symmetrical.
on the client to server
twice,
end.
Yeah.
All right, maybe we can take to the list to figure out exactly what the semantics
Kick
are.
it around a little bit, but I
Yeah.
think there's something there.
Yeah, so it sounds like client to server, the thing to have is a new thing in the JWS protected header. That's your version, and then maybe something in the server side. Dan?
Daniel Kahn-Gilmore. So I just wanted to point out that this doesn't mean we don't have to think about it at all, right? And we don't get upgrades for free just by having the version number indicated, right? If we have the version number, what we're doing basically is saying, as soon as we change the version number, all of the old clients are going to fail explicitly.
Yeah.
Yes.
So just
This is why I was concerned about wanting to bring some old clients along. But ultimately, I think maybe fast failure might be better. Is that what Thompson's about to say?
So Martin Thompson, we can decide not to change the version number and add things.
Oh yeah, sure.
Right. So there is that option, but then we'd have to think about it.
Yeah, there's no escaping thinking about it. I think we all agree there's no escaping thinking.
Really?
I guess that's what we're paid to do. Remind me to stop using TLS. All right, I think we're good on that. So right now, this one's also pretty simple. If you create a registration with one account key and then you try and you send another new registration account with the same account key, there's a requirement that the server return a 409 conflict response along with a pointer to the existing one. So the filer of the issue pointed out that this is way too harsh. It doesn't need to be an error. You should just return success and say you've found the one that is the real thing, and provide the URL there. Martin, it looks like you're having some feeling here. Maybe a 300 response would be more semantically clear. Yeah. Thompson suggests 302 found, which seems all right to me. It might be slightly non-trivial for clients that are just transparently handling, where the HTTP layer transparently handles redirects. You might not get the URL out easily, but I think we can find some ways to hack around that.
So Martin Thompson, you are returning a 201 in the case where you've created a new resource, right?
Right. So the two,
And it
yeah,
includes a location header.
exactly.
And the 302 will have a location header with the same information in it. If you just ignore what the status code is, you get the same result.
In principle, but I think in practice, some HTTP libraries treat 300 series differently from 200, right?
Not usually automatically.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's right.
XHR might do, but
yeah. Well, I think you could solve it anyway by having whatever the final response is also include the location header. Is that too suspect, Mr. HTTP? Okay. All right, we can hack around this somehow. Okay, so let the minutes reflect 302. Maybe we can crash the note server by sending it into some redirect loop. All right, okay, this is another kind of simple to conceptualize one. Right now we have two out-of-band things, and the question is, should we have one? We have an out-of-band requirement in the application flow where the server can say, before I will issue the certificate at all, you have to go do this thing, like the payment thing. And it's just a URL, you go to a website and do whatever it says there. We also have a similar thing at the challenge level, which was added, I think, in the last IETF cycle, which says, instead of doing one of the predefined challenges like HTTP or DNS or TLS-SNI, you have to do this other thing before I will consider you authorized for this identifier. So the difference here is just in what the out-of-band thing is gating, whether it's gating authorization or whether it's gating issuance of the certificate overall. Question is, should we kill one of these and just have one out-of-band thing? The argument for dropping one is sort of, why have two out-of-band? Do we need them both? The argument for keeping them would be that you could imagine a CA that migrated most of its flow over to Acme and just couldn't migrate its validation system. It would like to use all of Acme's state tracking and issuance flow and that, but it can't. It needs some specially crafted email-based or phase of the moon-based domain validation, and it needs to use the out-of-bound stuff for that. Anyone have strong preferences here? Not seeing a lot of action here. So I think my suggestion would be, I kind of have sympathy with the only do one out-of-band thing here. So unless there's objections, I don't think we can get rid of the requirement one because that's Phil's cache box, but I think we can get rid of the challenge one because that's at a finer level of granularity. So I think, unless there's objections, I think I'll go ahead with taking out the out-of-band challenge.
Are there objections? Please come to the mic now if you're in the room. All right, we'll confirm on the list, but looks like there are no objections in the room.
So Martin Thompson, just on the last one, I did some checking. It is possible to suppress the following of redirects on fetch.
In fetch, okay.
Yeah, I don't know about XHR because we've orphaned that one now.
Yeah. The other thing I would observe here is that if it turns out in some future scenario we need the out-of-band challenge thing, the challenge space is designed to be extensible, so it's trivial to add it back. We don't need to bump the version number. We can just add it back in. All right, so resolved, pending list confirmation. All right, this one is slightly more technical, and it goes back to that question we were discussing earlier about how do you roll from one account key to another. This is like iteration number 3 or 4 of the signing structures. So we did one that Karthik didn't quite like. We swapped the order of signatures in that, and then Jacob came along and came up with this parallel signature thing that we fixed with having both the new key and the old key. So right now, the structure you sign to change from an old key to a new key is you create this message that has both keys in it, both public keys, and then you sign with both private keys so that both keys agree to the changeover. That was sort of the critical property that that we need to get out of this message, is the assent of both keys to the handover. The issue in practice with this parallel signature thing is that it requires a multi-signature JWS, which a lot of JWS libraries that are out there don't support. And if you're doing I was doing some implementation work after publishing drafts. If you you could imagine building a nice transport layer for your Acme server where it validates one signature per post and reports up what key it did that validation with to the Acme layer. This breaks that pattern of every post being signed by a single key and has multiple keys. And so it's a little bit awkward from that design architecture aesthetic point of view. So the proposal here is just to serialize the signatures or to make the signatures go in sequence instead of in parallel.
I'm having a flashback to the last time we tried to count on a signature having a certain technical property. Have you had somebody verify that this is not depending on unauthorized properties at SIGOLD?
Yeah, so I think this was actually where we ended up with Karthik on the last go round. And then we went to the parallelized thing after Karthik said that would sort of be okay.
Okay. I mean, it's clear. I mean, I guess my point is it's not clear to me that SIGNU is a signature on M.
Oh, okay, yeah. I wrote that in clearly. So what I mean is that should read that you would send.
Wait, is the inner break is the inner
M
comma SIGOLD?
M comma SIGOLD.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Sorry about that. Yeah. So the proposed version is written wrong because I did it while jet lagged this morning. The inner signed content that is signed by the new key is M comma SIGOLD M. Right. So both keys end up signing over the content.
Just make sure it's unambiguous.
Yeah. What do you mean by unambiguous?
What I mean is that I don't want there to be confusion about which part of the message you're signing is the signature and which part is the message.
Oh, sure. Okay.
So
I think
if they're merely concatenated, we're
Yeah.
back to like, oh, what's the length of these things?
No. The way we did this in a couple of iterations ago was you just create a whole JWS object that has the payload and all that, and then you wrap it in another JWS object. So like it's a little bloaty, which is part of what Jacob didn't like when he did the parallelization, but it's in some ways conceptually simpler.
Ted Hardy, and I'm having a moment here that's making me feel like I'm missing something, and it may be just because I'm missing the M comma SIGOLD M here.
Yeah.
But I would have thought that it would have worked better to have SIGOLD sign M comma SIGNU M. But the thinking that somebody who could extract the part of the object that's M and SIGOLD M could then sign it with some other SIGNU, and therefore be asserting it based on an extracted signature of SIGOLD over M.
Yeah. Recall, however, that M includes both the old
right.
key and the new key.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
both
So,
keys are
okay.
signing over both keys.
Can I ask us to break away from this and look at the real struct? Do you have the real struct somewhere?
The current struct.
Yeah.
So that'll be the parallel. Yeah. Pull up the spec.
Okay.
If you-
Actually, just send to the list the actual struct when
Yeah. Okay.
when we take this, and I think that will help.
Yeah, we'll do.
All of us visually.
Yeah, Philhan Baker here. Yeah, I'm kind of confused. There is only going to be one copy of the blob that is signed, I hope. Because that.
Yes.
Yes.
That's correct.
Okay. Because that's not what you said. Yeah.
No, there is only.
Yeah, because the thing about the wrapping, I mean, like, I think the problem we have here is we have a notation that isn't JSON.
Yeah.
And to discuss this particular point, we need to see the JSON to understand what the hell's going on.
Totally agree. I apologize, jet lag. No, the idea is that you will have a JWS whose payload is the message. The signing key for that JWS will be the old key. And then that whole JWS will be serialized, base64 encoded, and become the payload of another JWS whose signing key is the new key. So there's one copy of the message being signed, which is inside all of that layer of wrapping, inside the inside the inner JWS, which is the payload of the outer JWS. Like I said, it is kind of bloaty. There's a bunch of base64 encoding here, but let me send the concrete stuff to the list. Yeah, just
I just wanted to give this is a sort of a data point. I'm sorry, Brian Campbell. You mentioned a lot of the Jose libraries only support a single signature model of JWS, which is true. I happen to have one of those libraries, but I got an issue filed on asking about how to do exactly what you were proposing in the most recent one. I do want to say that it is almost trivial to support the multiple signature model as long as you don't make use of like the unprotected headers to hold the algorithm or anything kind of funny like that. The way you've done it now, I don't think the limitation on library support for it is particularly a big concern, because you can take libraries like mine that don't support and it's like a few lines to just kind of mix and match and put it in there. So for whatever it's worth, I don't have a sort of dog in the fight, but I don't think it's a major like stumbling block.
Yeah. Okay, fair point. Yeah, I still like kind of the architectural point a little bit better, but it sounds like there's no huge concerns raised here. So this will probably end up being a discussion between Jacob and myself, because we're kind of on opposite sides of this. So we'll hash it out and get the proposals to the list for more concrete feedback. And again, apologies for the really confusing notation here. Next. Does anyone care about nonces? Anyone feeling overwhelmed with nonces? The Let's Encrypt guys posted a suggestion that we try and be a little more economical with the replay nonces we provide. So right now, the server is required to provide a fresh replay nonce that the client can use in a post request on every successful response, be that a GET response, a POST response, a HEAD response, whatever response you send that succeeds has to have a replay nonce header in it. Makes it really easy for a client to get a nonce when it needs to send a post request. In the clients I've written, you just send a head request to the same resource, get a nonce, and then do a post request. The concern the Let's Encrypt guys raised was that this causes the server to have to keep a bunch of nonces, keep state about a bunch of nonces that may be outstanding, and most of which will never get used because they were in response to something, some GET request, and the client wasn't even looking for a replay nonce. So they suggested that to restrict the requirement to only requiring the server to provide nonces in post responses. And then if you provide them in response to post responses, that means you can sort of do a chain of post responses. You do a request, you get a nonce in the response that you can use for the next request, and so on. So you can have a conversation that way, but then you need some sort of way to kick the whole thing off. So you need some resource you can not send a post to, that will give you or you can send a request other than a post to, that will give you a nonce to kick off the whole process. I am stating the arguments for completeness, but I really think this is not really an issue. If you look at, there are ways to maintain lots of nonces without, that scale in proportion to the number of nonces that are used, not the number of nonces that are issued. So I'm inclined to let this one drop unless someone feels strongly about this. There might be more discussion on the list, but I'm not seeing anyone in the room leaping to the mic on this.
By drop, you mean just close the issue?
Just close the issue and leave the requirement as it is. Yeah.
So Martin Thompson, I know that I've just been discussing replay of post requests in the last session. I wonder if we could send the same nonce on every request and not actually check them, and it would still work. You will end up with extra authorizations.
If the server could send the same nonce?
Yeah, I mean, to sort of comply with the spec and allow clients to do whatever they want, but ultimately not actually worry about this, because what are the consequences of replay in this situation?
That's almost as bad as the other suggestion that was made on the list, which was just dropping the replay nonce altogether.
Well, that's effectively what I'm suggesting.
Yeah.
Why is that bad?
Sort of for the same reason we have the URL thing, to protect from CDNs replaying requests. For example, a new cert request you could replay and get a new cert with the same parameters.
Because there's no time in that?
There is not currently a notion of time. It's all non-spaced.
Right. And so the new cert request could happen at any time.
Yeah, you can, wait and any time throughout the length of the authorization.
Okay.
I mean, that may not be a big deal because, the attacker in this case might not have the private key, but maybe he does. So I'm inclined to keep, I am disinclined to drop the replay protection. Yeah. Let's all wait for Ecker.
Yeah, I wouldn't drop the replay protection, but this strikes me as a false economy.
Meaning the proposal does.
Yes.
So
I mean, like any operational server is like probably records about 4 kilobytes of data for every single HTTP request it receives. So like the having to also store 128 bits or so of nonce for some short period of time does not strike me as a particularly onerous obligation.
Yeah. Okay. Sounding like there's some agreement with the proposal, leave the requirement as it is. Next slide. Yeah, okay, so after having drafted the applications flow, which we will re-add the new authorization flow to, as Ecker pointed out the need, there were some questions that arise and some things you could do with this new application flow that are not in the spec right now. So if you look at the SSL-made API, which has a similar sort of request a certificate, apply for a certificate, get requirements flow, that API requires the client to send another request to actually issue the certificate. So once all the requirements have been met, the client has to say, yes, I want this certificate, go ahead and issue it. So I dropped an open issue in the doc as to whether we should have that extra step there, require basically a confirmation from the client that you should go ahead, that the server should issue the certificate. I note that this morning, Andrew Ayer, the SSL-made author, said, no, we should not do this. Given his operational experience, it was not worth the extra step. Anyone in the room have feedback on that question? Seems simpler just to leave it as it is. Guess I'll leave it that way until someone complains. The other thing you can do is consider making these requests modifiable or supporting multiple CSRs. So maybe a CA will allow a single order to issue both issue certificates for both RSA and ECDSA keys for the same subject. And so you could send in 2 CSRs at once and have the request end up issuing multiple certificates. Ted, you're furrowing your brow here. While he's walking, I'll say the other use case to this is renewal. So you might want to enable a client to say, change the dates on this, on the application, change not before, not after, and cause that to reissue a certificate with new dates, assuming all the requirements are still satisfied. Ted.
Ted Hardy from the floor microphone, for those in the ether. I was just trying to imagine how much savings there was really going to be in not having each of the multiple CSRs be in a separate application, because that seems to be the obvious option here. And I was wondering if you had any, what are we actually saving by not having them be in their independent applications?
Yeah, so from chatting with Andrew, I understand that there are some CA cases right now where you're paying for the order, and if you get them both together, they're considered as one order and one transaction, and you pay once for both of those certificates. I don't know if that's something we need to reflect at this layer of the protocol.
I don't think so.
Okay.
So personally speaking, I would say that putting that into the state mechanics doesn't seem sensible. If they want to do that, they can have an order ID where if you're all associated with the same order ID, the order ID means that you pay your transaction fee just once. If you use this handy code, maybe they could reuse the nonce for that. No, I didn't mean that. But yeah, I'm not a huge fan.
How about renewal while you're up? Any thoughts on that?
I don't have thoughts on renewal.
Okay.
I need to think more about it.
Robin.
Oh, Richard, yeah. So relaying for Andrew Ayer. He says the reason why SSL mate needs the extra step is because our API doesn't have challenges. Acme does, so it's redundant.
Excellent. Nice, clear answer. Okay, so I will delete that open issue from the spec, consider it closed. And it's sounding like I'm not hearing, I think the issue of modifiables and multiples, I noticed Andrew posted some feedback to the list this morning, and I haven't had any time to look at that. So there may be, I think he's had some thoughts on, he did have some thoughts on renewal, Ted. So I will consider that remaining open for now. Recovery, to move on down here. So we, at the original draft of Acme, all the way back at the individual submission stage, had not one, but two mechanisms by which an account holder who had lost his account key could recover his account and gain control of it again. Contact-based recovery, send me an email sort of recovery, and a MAC-based recovery scheme where you used a short code that you've been provided by the CA. Both of those have since been removed from the spec. I think I've still got some notes in my to-do list to think about doing this. There was some discussion, Karthik's analysis pointed to some recovery mechanisms that would be workable, that would be good to have. And so there was some thought about, outlining a recovery mechanism in here that you could instantiate in a few ways, but not actually providing a concrete instantiation. Benefit would be that, we would capture for posterity, this framework that we'd agreed was cryptographically sound, if only you had a way to provision the right bits. And so save the risk of getting it wrong. In principle, reduce the risk of getting it wrong later. But it wouldn't really provide much utility in the short term. So I guess the proposal here is to kind of declare recovery well and truly dead. Does anyone think that losing your account key is something we really need to worry about? I guess is this. Yeah, a recovery mechanism in Acme.
I mean, it's clearly the case that an actual operational CA needs some way to deal with this.
Well, yes. Well, not necessarily. I mean, like if the only requirement is that you show up and you validate your domains, like in principle, you could just generate a new key pair, validate all your domains, and yeah, it's a bit of a headache, but you haven't lost anything really huge.
I mean, I think we discussed this when Let's first started, right? And one of the explicit concerns was that it would not be possible to reissue for domains which had already been issued for without extreme measures. And so merely showing up with a new account key and validating your domains makes it hard to discriminate between the situation where I've decided to take over all your accounts and the situation where you actually lost your account key. So now maybe an out-of-scope mechanism is sufficient for resetting that and you don't need to recover the key.
Yeah.
But I do not think it is the case that you do not need to be able to have a situation in which people lose their keys and discriminate from that situation in which I'm trying to take over your accounts.
Okay, so
But I think it'd be fun. I think that one way to handle that would be to say that the recovery mechanisms were inherently basically manual, and that the way a CA handles this is by basically having a manual process which resets you back to the state as if these domains had ever been registered, and then allows you to do it again. And the advantage of that would be that does not introduce new ComSec logic errors in the system otherwise, because the worst case scenario is that you're back to ground zero as opposed to that you've recovered the account key. So I think that'd be fine. But I think something should be said here.
Okay.
I mean, maybe you can get away with this back. I guess my point is the first question you want to ask is, what if I lose the account key? And so your answer is going to be, this is out of scope for the protocol.
That's the question on the table.
So I think
is this something we say CAs have to solve on their own, however they do it?
I guess I would suggest some guidance would be appropriate. Okay. But I think guidance would be fine to say that CAs should probably have some manual process of some kind for dealing with account key recovery, and then we recommend that they basically just delete the account rather than trying to recover the key.
So Martin Thompson, I mean, part of the additional extra steps that you might do is have different challenges in response to, or more challenges in response to the request to create authorizations for which an existing account already has, or an existing registration already has authorization. I mean, that could be a policy choice that the CA could make.
Yeah, that's definitely a CA policy choice.
Russ Housley. So what I think you're saying is that the CA still remembers the public key, but for whatever reason, the client can't remember or
I forgot my password.
the private
Yeah.
key or the key to recover it from whatever file he has, right? So I think a section on operational considerations that says you need a way to create a replacement account key as opposed to doing any kind of recovery, because that encourages one to store it in some other place, like in the cloud or whatever.
Well, so let me, oh, go ahead.
I was going to ask Russ at the mic whether he would be willing to draft some text as a initial take on this to provide to the working group.
Sure.
So just for context here, the recovery mechanism we sketched out with Karthik was basically the rollover mechanism here, except you would
that
roll
you
over.
can't sign with the old.
Well, you can roll over not from the old key to the new key, but you can roll over from a Mac key to a new key if you've provisioned.
But then
this
what if
Mac
you don't
key
know where
somewhere.
that is? I mean, that leads to the same
Yeah.
situation as the revoke your certificate if by signing a revocation request with your revocation key and right. So it's just what key did I lose that I can't do what you expected me to do?
Yeah. Yeah, so I think Ecker is probably about right by providing, and Russ about providing operational considerations and kind of resetting things. So Russ, was the answer to Ted's question? You'll craft some text for us? Okay, great. Fantastic. All right. Yeah, and the only last question here was we have the way we do scoping in draft 03 is the authorization struct has a scope field in it, which is either not present or it is the URL for an application to which this authorization belongs. Pretty rudimentary scoping, but I think it covers at least some use cases. And the question is if there's a need for more. This is probably not really useful to discuss right now, but just to throw a flag in case people have use cases that need more different scoping or something else. All right, I think that's all I've got for open issues. Yeah, so last call, it's a thing. Next slide. For those who might not have the IETF process swapped in, this is my cartoon of the process, where
Not
you know,
to scale?
not to scale, roughly scaled. Right. So this idea is well, really, it should be kind of spiky. Where work occurs at IETF deadlines during the actual work phase. So yeah, the idea is, we've done a bunch of work on this, refining it, and then there's a bunch of last calls for comments and ballots that go out before it gets to be an RFC. But the idea is, once we send it off on that path, we should feel pretty comfortable that all the major issues have been addressed. So the question is, do we at least have a list of the major issues that we need to address as we prepare to send this off in the sometime in the fall? So the next slide. So we had a few things left over from the previous section, some action items for the authors to resolve. This is kind of when I was a working group chair, I used the second to last call for comments. It's a call for issues, anything that you think is ambiguous or not covered by the current spec. So I think it would be good to have a list of issues pretty soon now. People could flush those issues out to the list kind of as soon as possible. And then we can work on getting those addressed in the next few weeks. It would also be good to have at least a couple of implementations of the latest spec. I've talked to the Let's Encrypt guys. They're going to start working on upgrading their server pretty soon now. If you go to the next slide, the rough timeline I've got in my mind, at least, talking with the other authors, is getting together with the feedback from this meeting and the issue list and kind of hammering out a bunch of the stuff that we know is outstanding right now and turning that into another working group draft, which we'll consider sort of an implementation target. So that the Let's Encrypt guys will start implementing. Hopefully some other folks out there who have clients or servers will start implementing as well. and we can get some experience with whatever the latest this implementation draft is. I guess it would be probably 04. So I think the hope would be produce that sometime mid next month. I have more confidence in that than I did the last time estimate I gave at the last IETF meeting. And then we could look at implementation through September, maybe have a virtual interim to address any issues that come up as we do implementation, and aim for a working group last call in October.
So note that the next meeting for the IETF, that's a face-to-face meeting, is in November 13th through 18th, and it is the intention of this group that this should go up to the IESG before that meeting. And so we consider that the goal. So this timeline is to accomplish that. Everybody understand and okay with the timeline? Of course, we could be faster than this if people are interested in being faster, and trust me, we would be very happy with that.
Really, it's all gated on Russ at this point. It's a really important paragraph.
Don't lose the key.
Yeah. All right. So yeah, I'll get together with the other authors after the IETF meeting and see if we can get this hammered out and get some implementation going. Okay. So I think that is the end of my slides. Oh, right. I had one more thing. So speaking of implementation, after getting draft 03 out, I thought, gee, wouldn't it be great to actually have an implementation of the current spec going? So I started one up, next slide, reviving some old code. Joe Hildebrand and I had started work on a Node.js implementation of Acme. So I've kind of revived that under the branding Rocket Skates, you know, Acme. It's designed to be light and fast. The idea here is to have kind of a pedagogical client and server stack, so to demonstrate what the architecture is of the protocol, help people understand the protocol, help people do testing of their other implementations, and maybe provide some test suites. Still very much a work in progress right now. I've got a transport layer together, which is how I got thinking about all of this parallel signature stuff. Server-side logic is mostly complete, and I haven't done anything with the client side. So if anyone is interested in collaborating or providing feedback here, very interested in getting this hack together. That is actually the end of my slides.
Okay, so we'll go back to the chair slides now. And I'm about to throw this up in the air, and he's going to call whether he's going to be blank or have words, and whoever gets the upside will take red, and whoever gets the downside will take green. So,
Sure. Words.
words came up, you're red.
Okay.
All right. If you are red-green colorblind, my apologies. The left side is the contrary or red side, and the green side is the proponent or green side.
Okay, so given the timetable that's been proposed and we seem to have agreement on, the question is, what do we do next? Or do we do anything, if anything, next? I'll point out that the next meeting is November in Seoul, which might have lesser attendance. But are there any things that we want to consider taking on as new work? Do we want to just not meet and declare victory and wait and see what happens? Anyone prepared to make a proposal at this point for what stuff to add?
No, you're supposed to argue red.
I'm supposed to argue red. Okay, we're done, right? I think it would be great if the minutes from this meeting had 2 sentences, which are about to go into last call, recommend no recharter. I don't think our AD would have any problem with that.
Yep. Pardon?
Whatever the work group wants to do.
Yeah, sure.
And so now I'll argue the green side, and it's clear that there are some other potential use cases for automated certificate management. We know those now, recharter to handle those and remain available as a working group for spec bugs and a potential BIS should operational experience show that. So,
What are some examples of use cases?
Yeah, I was going to ask Richard's question. So how many drafts are there waiting for working group adoption, Ted?
Well, there are none now, but we have discouraged anybody from trying to get ahead of the finishing of this one. So I don't know that there are none sitting in edit buffers waiting for.
When has discouragement ever worked?
Right now. Yeah.
Well, so we flipped a coin to see who was going to take which one. As the green proponent, I have to say, there clearly are cases for certificate management where there is no web server involved. And so some of the challenges are inappropriate to that sort of automated certificate management. People have discussed, for example, creating a client certificate mechanism in Acme that would be appropriate to Jabber clients, for example. That sort of thing wouldn't be covered by the current set of challenges at all. And it is work we could consider taking on. Now, I do not know that anybody has an edit buffer full of this, but this is sort of the, do we want to kick off discussion on the mailing list with the presumption that we're going to close down before Seoul, or we're going to send things off before Seoul, not meet in Seoul because we have no work on our plate, and we would recharter a new working group if work came up? Or do you want to say, nah, let's be realistic. Once somebody's built a building block, people want to build new things with it. We'll presume that those new things come in after this, and that starts in Seoul. That's the argument.
So just to provide people some concrete use cases, other things we might do. The things I've had in my head and don't even have an edit buffer right now, where I think there would actually be some potential uptake and some real usage are, one, doing Acme for EV certificates, assuming we get the whole payment thing working and there's some automation to be done. I've talked to some folks who do EV issuance and do automation around EV issuance, and they'd be interested. I've got some folks who would be interested in contributing, but like I said, nothing even in an edit buffer right now. The other thing that I think I've heard a few folks mention is the idea of extending the CAA, the CA authorization domain DNS record, which currently right now can say these are the CAs that are authorized to issue for me. I've heard some folks ask to also have an extension of that where you can specify Acme validation mechanisms to whitelist only HTTP validation should be done or only DNS validation should be done. So just to, again, not in an edit buffer, but has been proposed by multiple people, so there might be some interest around that. So yeah, just to give people an idea of what some of these extensions might be.
Yeah, Martin Thompson, the reason I got up to ask that question is I'm not actually seeing anything, but thanks to Richard, I'm seeing a couple of those things. It is perhaps the right plan here to use this time to solicit at least very rough drafts on those ones, so we can sort of get an idea of what's out there. And when we're obviously not closing the working group tomorrow, so we do have a little bit of time to collect that information. So once we get to the point where... I was just looking
at our area director to make sure she wasn't closing the working group tomorrow. Whenever I'm running one of these things, I get nervous.
Where we're actually done with this document, which, yeah, it should be fairly soon, we might have a better idea.
Yeah, so Kathleen Moriarty, and thank you, Martin. I think having some drafts would be good before we're actually changing a charter, right? Because then you could sit forever and do nothing.
Phil Humbaker. Yeah, I think there are a bunch of application areas as well we've got to think of, because Acme was really targeted at TLS, and there's a bunch of other stuff I'd like to do with it. I'd like to be able to use Acme with DNSSEC. I would like to be able to use Acme with S-MIME. And there are different authentication challenges that are going to be required. And in the case of S-MIME, you want to be able to send and receive the messages over SMTP, because, you know, having a mail client trying to get certificates and having to do web transactions doesn't work.
So this is Ted Hardy with a chair hat on, even though I'm standing in the pink box mic. I have a question to our area director of whether in the cases like that, where it's a significantly different application, whether we would like to do it in a working group focused on the CA management or focused on the application. That is, would it go to something like LAMPS to do this work, or would it stay here?
So Kathleen Moriarty, I think it depends if a working group exists, right? And if that's the right choice or not, and what this group wants to do, right? Because you'll have a clean slate when this work is done. So lamps would be a clear case for SMIME and P2P stuff, but I think Philip also said IPsec, right? So
No, DNSSEC. So it would be
DNSSEC, okay,
DNS
sorry.
op or somebody in the Dane community.
Right,
might do
right. So it
that.
might go over, right. So I think let's just take it case by case and see what comes in, if there's an existing working group or not. Sometimes it's not the right place to do that, right? So I have another working group right now that one draft isn't getting enough review, and I think it should have gone over to a different group, and that might happen.
Relaying for Eric Berger. Are there enough drafts or ideas of drafts that they need more than AD sponsored?
So I think what I've heard so far is that there's some ideas and we need to see some drafts and then decisions can be made. So I don't think we're to the point that Eric is at, because no, there aren't drafts yet. There's ideas, and we need to see if those drafts come to fruition, and we need to see if we like them and think they should be adopted.
Matt Miller. I was just coming up to say, yes, I think putting out the word on the list would help. The discouragement was very effective. I know that there were ideas. I do not recall what they were, but even myself and many others said, let's wait until we finish the main work before trying to do anything here.
Okay, so it sounds like the resolution of the red-green is going to be kind of a light brown mud color, where we blend them into the request to the mailing list that says, hey, if you had an idea or an edit buffer that would be post V1 working group last call, between, let's say, now and September, try and commit the first electrons to paper, and give us a chance to look at that in sort of the September timeframe to figure out whether we need to meet in Seoul to discuss adoption of new milestones and work items. Having come to the end of that discussion, is there any other business for the good of the order? Hearing none, we're done. Go get you some cookies.
Thank you. Blue sheets, circulate them, sign them, bring them up.
I'm sure it's used in more than that. I think it is very. Or, you know, actually, if you want to put one beside it. I would say I probably put about half of one. Because there were I remember looking and going, maybe I should go in there, be back there, but like, oh, let's. Oh, that's the thing. Yeah. And so my. I know, maybe, I mean, like, yeah, that's like not really, like, you're doing the right thing now. As far as I'm saying. Literally this code that doesn't even relate to testing, so it connects. And I had to rewrite this, I wasn't sure if we were ready, I'm going to go back there, but yours was pretty, yours had moved off to emotionals. I have a question. Yours also was like really recursive, not recursive, but like. You know, so but say you're. Yeah, that is. Yeah, this is the last thing I wrote last time. You see what I mean? Like this is like. Not that much code. And it's much. I mean, basically, it's much. Just. I mean, there may be. Yeah, but like, I mean, it's cycles up from like all these. And that doesn't it's very good, right? Now I've got to write these. I've got to write the test for it now. Before they got to fix it, that's a check-verification. Maybe I'll do it. They always do that. You know what we should do? I got it. That is that saves that one in case it takes SS. And it's the same secretary info, it takes SS. And then fills in. Let's try to know the structure from Digo to cat. Maybe it used to be the secretary, it isn't anymore. And so. I mean, there's a validity. Yeah. Yes, but it does, they're both right. It doesn't give you KDA. KDA and SIG out. And so, you're saying maybe I can use maybe I can do the yeah, maybe a little more specific. So anyone who sees so the way we're not really easy to attack. The initial connection with authenticated but discarded time. Yeah. Or they have, yeah, there's a handful of which have concept? No, concept. Thank you very much. So sorry. It's actually, yeah. So, it's like significant work to